Our political leaders are routinely portrayed as incompetent in the media. This is a deception in which we willingly engage in order to protect ourselves from the truth, that we are not sovereign and that our politicians are actively working against us. It is a particularly British trait to shield oneself with ironic cynicism, which allows the adoption of a certain aloofness. Such aloofness is highly desirable when sincere and utilised in a tactically astute manner, but is decadent and negligent when adopted as a means to blind oneself to the harsh reality of the power structure. Our politicians are not our representatives. They are faces for real power. Much of their role has been outsourced to private companies, who secured these informal civic contracts through heavy lobbying and global corporate power projection into domestic domains, a fusion of public and private. These entities have interests wildly divergent from the electorate. If elite and non-elite interests were closely aligned, there would be no need for the powerful to pour so much money into politics. As such, the politicians are faced with a choice between satisfying their public commitments or representing the corporate and transnational interests who assemble the shortlist for democratic elections via selective financing and PR control. When one considers this, and the fact that a stint in government is merely a rehearsal or internship for a future career beyond politics, it is unsurprising that politicians should consistently act against their own stated mandates. This difference between words and actions must be explained in order to preserve the masquerade of democratic sovereignty, and the selected theme is that of incompetent leadership. In the media, the illusion of incompetence is facilitated via two means. Firstly, satire, and secondly, the archetype of the public attack dog, a fearless media personality, champion of the people. The portrayal of incompetent leadership has two important effects. Firstly, it gives the subject population an illusory feeling of superiority over the ruling class, anaesthetising them. Secondly, it implicates the subject population in the political failures of their leaders. After all, it was they who chose the government, democratically no less. Thus, when leaders fail to deliver on the promises made to the electorate, and instead covertly pursue the interests of the largely invisible elite whom they actually represent, it is not a betrayal, but the fault of the electorate, who are the true sovereigns in a democratic system, or so we are solemnly told. Meanwhile, the public are distracted by the extremely well-produced show in the media. While most of the show consists of pseudo-events, events which are created purely to be reported upon. For example, an announcement that a politician is going to give a particular announcement later in that day. There is also a vast array of satirical offerings. Satire is borderline sacred to the liberal democracy, allegedly functioning to keep the powerful in check. But popular satire is projected through the corporate media, and thus must operate within a framework which is agreeable to those who own the media organisations. Coincidentally, these same people make substantial donations to the political machine, and have far more in common with their fellow non-media elites than they do with the viewers. Only a fool in this position would allow a robust critique of his motivations and misdeeds. He would be instantly ostracised by furious contemporaries, themselves exposed by association. Such a weakling would be thrown to the mob and replaced by a more circumspect rival. Thus the limits of satire are determined by the most obvious targets of the satire. Those who attempt to operate independently will find themselves in conflict with a vast corporate machine, which will either ignore or punish them. In mass media satire, truth is to be found between the lines, if at all. A pair of highly rated sitcoms, separated by several decades, display this rather well. In Yes Minister, we find highly competent and Machiavellian civil servants, totally beyond democratic censure, running rings around the bumbling politician Jim Hacker, ruthlessly enacting their own eternal agenda. Immediately, this massages the public ego in the manner I described above. But there is an interesting angle presented through the character of Frank Weisel, Hacker's astute and idealistic working-class advisor. Weisel is constantly sidelined and referred to as Weasel by the civil servants. This is revealing, as Weisel represents the broader public, to whom support Hacker owes his position. The contempt that the civil servants have for Weisel and by association, the public, is the most honest theme within the programme. Where it lacks, and to be fair, draws its comedic energy from, is in the presentation of Hacker as an idiot in perpetual conflict with the permanent machinery of government. In reality, ministers and civil servants have much more in common than is represented in the show. To put this within the framework of Hans Hermann Hoppe, described in his book Democracy, the God That Failed, they are operatives of a publicly owned state. As such, they do not privately own and exploit a productive asset. They own the right to exploit a public asset for a limited period of time. Whereas the civil servant's schedule of exploitation is measured in the length of a career, the politician's is measured in the length of an election cycle, much of which must be spent in the process of securing re-election. His other primary incentive is preparation for a post-political career, which could arrive at any moment, in contrast to the civil servant who, beyond democratic uncertainty, may advance at his leisure. The post-political career will be financed by elites, not the public, and so both have an incentive to prioritise elite interests whilst in power. If they don't, they will face a competitive disadvantage against better-funded adversaries backed by an elite PR machine. In Austrian terms, this difference in time horizon, and thus time preference, explains the conflict between civil servants and politicians, not loyalty to the electorate. In essence, they are playing the same game at different speeds. With this in mind, both the conflict between Hacker and the civil service, and the characterisation of Hacker as incompetent, represent deflections from the realities of power. Overall, though, the programme contains about as much truth as can be expected, and the civil servants will often say the quiet part out loud. By the turn of the millennium, the subtle conflict presented in Yes Minister had decayed into the eternal clusterfuck of the thick of it. Whilst the thick of it displays rather neatly the repulsiveness of the party machine, this is always emphasised as a function of incompetence and reactive, not premeditated self-interest. Everything is absurd, to the extent that it is hard to think of a single redemptive character in the programme, or to perceive any kind of arc for the protagonists. The closest approximation is Malcolm Tucker, a psychopath who is at least highly effective in his role. Tellingly, again, Tucker is a special advisor, not an elected official. In the thick of it, there is no hope for competent leadership of any kind. A sense of nihilism pervades, to which guffawing and self-congratulatory irony is the only response. Outside of drama are the worst offenders, panel shows, shiny surrogates for a night in the pub with your friends. Chief amongst these is Have I Got News for You, which manages to summon the soullessness of the thick of it via a panel composition which can only be described as the wall of bugmen, gelded comedians, hereditary journalists with verified Twitter accounts, and the occasional politician attempting to masquerade as an actual human. Have I Got News for You is intellectual self-harm for midwits. Finessing the line between fiction and non-fiction, we find Chris Morris, in his uncanny turn as a malfunctioning Jeremy Paxman in The Day-to-Day and Brassai. It is important to note that Morris was effectively cancelled before it was cool, after straying off the reservation and landing a few too many hits on establishment figures along the way, particularly in the media sphere. There was always something more to Morris. Though nihilistic, his darkness represented at least a refusal to give in fully to masturbatory irony. And Morris's Paxman was significant, because it undermined an absolutely critical element of media containment, which persists to this day: the archetype of the public attack dog. The public attack dog conducts short and unsophisticated interrogations which border on mock trials. Prepared and supported live by a whole team, the attack dog blends legitimate questioning with a barrage of decontextualized data, anonymous accusations, and blatant logical fallacies. The accused squirms, stutters, and fails to answer the questions transparently. The public is supposed to live vicariously through these ordeals, exquisitely packaged into time segments ready to be rotated back into the broader media cycle. Whilst the odd head is taken, any fallen minister falls only as far as an outrageously well-paid position at the nearest NGO, or finds himself circulating on the back benches, waiting for the storm to blow over. This comically adversarial format of political media is designed to legitimise the press. Despite the widespread lack of trust in the media, these asymmetric encounters have the effect of presenting them as at least relatively competent compared to our sputtering government avatars, sweating under studio lights. This is important for the maintenance of the actual power structure, which, like the media, is not selected democratically. In fact, popular and competent figures who contradict regime-approved narratives are systematically excluded from mass public discourse by the press. This acts as a safety valve which prevents such ideas from entering the political mainstream. Bestowed with a whiff of unjustified competence, if not trust, the media are able to anoint favourites and define the boundaries of the Overton window on behalf of the power structure. All they have to do is turn off the grief machine for the chosen ones and present them in a cosy and competent light. An anointed champion is instantly favoured over a bumbling heel fidgeting his way through a roasting on Newsnight. An excellent example of this was recently identified by Academic Agent. In a segment on Good Morning Britain, an exhumed Tony Blair crawled out of the catacombs to face not charges of war crimes and treason, but rather a buffet of underarm bowling from his own former spin doctor, Alistair Campbell. In the coming days, former Blairites filled prestigious media slots, lauding his record and positioning him for a comeback. This absolutely extraordinary carry-on exposed quite how managed the perception of competence is, and how explicitly the media serves the rulers, not the subjects. This is about control and money. If you want that, you have to suckle at the fat tit of the ruling class. The retention of such power rests heavily on the ability to control public opinion and direct public behaviour. Managing perceptions of competence is an advanced tactic in this regard, because the public erroneously internalise the perceptions as their own. They mistake enemies for friends and voluntarily accelerate their own subjugation. Some of the most sophisticated minds on earth, backed by vast economic resources, tune the constant cycle of arousal and demoralisation to stimulate maximum engagement, which ensures maximum profitability. Conversely, the relentless turgidity of domestic politics is an itch that cannot be scratched. A form of cognitive dissonance is induced by the failure of all this media energy to translate into anything approaching a satisfactory outcome. The frustration hypnotises the public, and endless hours are spent discussing diversionary issues and lashing out at the perceived incompetence of their leaders. Conversely, how easily and quietly may an entire manufacturing sector be moved to a region of the world where slave labour is readily exploitable? How freely do the SSRIs and pharmaceutical opioids flow into the resulting, gutted Western communities, all for the benefit of hostile globalist billionaires with their fingers in both pies? None of this appears anywhere on an election manifesto and is spun away in the corporate press, routinely occluded by the spectacle of an unfortunate minion being hot-seated on some other extraneous issue, for example, an alpaca on death row. The minion will, of course, be rewarded with a lucrative post-political career once his 15 minutes of shame is over, because loyalty is worth its weight in gold. Despite the media image, the leadership are highly competent at representing their true masters, the same class of elites who own and operate the media environment in which the charade is played out. Incompetent leadership is a smokescreen deployed to confuse the public, who are then incriminated in their own subjugation. As kleptocratic elites clear out the larder, a few rotten morsels are tossed back to the public, to be flung cathartically at the leaders. There is less bread now, but the circus is bigger than ever.